Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Science Business Public Conference. This is the first after the summer break. I hope the summer break has been relaxing to all of you. Once again, we were hoping to be able to host you physically, and once again we had to turn to a virtual conference. We will turn to hybrid events soon. Stay tuned. But thank you very much for joining us today. Compete or cooperate? What's the new normal for global R&D? Well, this is what we're going to discuss today. The pandemic has profoundly changed the world generally, and especially the world of science and technologies. Countries around the world are implementing strategies to protect their know-how, to protect their technologies, to protect their intellectual property, to secure their supply chains and to ensure their national security. But at the same time, climate change or worldwide pandemics such as COVID-19 cannot be solved without international cooperation. The quantum revolution cannot happen without international safeguards. So this afternoon, with a fantastic lineup of speakers, we are going to look through the lens of health, climate and quantum. Well, this balance, the need to find the right path between this unavoidable competition and the need for international cooperation. When you're watching this conference on an online platform that has plenty of functionalities, so you can connect with other participants, you can take a look at what Science Business does in the exhibition hall. There will be networking sessions as well. There will be one halfway through the conference. Take a look, navigate, enjoy. The Q&A function is on, and please use it whenever you'd like. During the panel sessions, the Science Business moderators will take questions from the audience. The last thing to mention is that this is a Science Business Conference, and our journalists are covering the debates. There is a live blog on the Science Business website, and there will be news. So if you don't want to miss any news update, feel free to sign up to the newsletter. All right, so we have a vast menu ahead of us. So without further ado, well, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Dzau. Dr. Dzau is well, good morning, Victor. Very welcome and very happy to see you today. This is the morning in the US. Dr. Dzau is the president of the US National Academy of Medicine, but he also has a number of international mandates. He's a member of the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. He also serves on the steering committee of Accelerator, and he's going to tell us all about it. But in that function, he works very closely to the G20 countries, WHO, Gavi, and others. So he has both these perspectives from an international point of view and the US point of view. So Victor, I'm going to hand over to you now, and please tell us, how much did COVID transform the international landscape for research cooperation in health, and what were the challenges, or what are still the challenges that come in the way of this international collaboration? Victor.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Marilyn, thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this very important conference, Compete or Cooperate, what's the new norm for global R&D? And I think it's an important question because we are seeing COVID, climate change, as you said, and other areas where competition and cooperation are both needed. I'm Victor Dzau. I'm not only speaking as an academic president, but I'm also a scientist, a global health leader, and also been actively involved with the business sector of things, being on corporate boards and starting up companies. So I'm well versed in the broader issue of competition and cooperation. May I have the next slide, please? So this first slide just kind of, in some ways, sets the stage for this conversation. You know, according to Barry Lin, Open Market Institute, there are two ways to cooperate. Good cooperation, to to compete. Good competition and bad competition. Good competition, we get business, powerful people to compete for everyone and in the state, for everyone's sake. But bad competition is when powerful people get others to compete for their own sake. So if you look at market competition, where really it benefits society, it may harm some participants, but overall it's beneficial. For example, within OECD countries, competition is more broadly accepted as the best available mechanism for maximizing things that one can demand from an economic system in most circumstances. Competition can yield low cost and prices for goods and services, more choices, and greater efficiency and productivity, economic growth, development, and more innovation. Competition can spur innovation, accelerate development of a whole variety of products, including life-saving vaccines, diagnostic therapeutics, such as mRNA vaccines. However, competition is not always beneficial to society because it can make people less cooperative, promote selfishness and free riding, and reduce contribution to public goods and leave society worse off. So, for example, competition benefits society when individual and group interests and incentives are aligned. However, difficulties arise when individual interests and group interests diverge. And so competition between countries can be good, but at the time of COVID, as we see, competition can be bad. Next slide. So I'd like to say a word about, in fact, COVID and what we've learned from this pandemic. I think we've seen a collective failure for the world to take pandemic prevention, preparedness, response seriously before this COVID-19 and prioritize it. There's not enough competition and preparation. There were major challenges every component of detection and response in almost all countries, whether surveillance, public health system, R&D, access to countermeasures such as vaccine. Now, we did see at COVID some bright spots, the unprecedented speed of vaccine development, and that certainly is a result of competition, in this case, mainly within industry, and Act A, which I'll talk about, the access to COVID tools accelerator, where major actors have come together to coordinate, to collaborate, to accelerate the production and equitable access to COVID-19 tests, diagnostic, and vaccines. Now, sadly, I think we learned many lessons from failures, particularly, as Marilyn said, vaccine nationalism, competition among countries for vaccines, insufficient supply of and manufacturing, lack of financing, and of course the need for global health and financing governance. Next slide. Now, when we look at the beginning of the outbreak, back in early 2020, there was no global strategy for preparedness response. And there's no global entity with a mandate and the financing arrangement to coordinate multiple independent actors. Yes, we have WHO, which is a very excellent organization. Its work is to monitor and support member states in particularly developing capacity, coordinate the states in preparedness response and response to emergency, like a fire department, but lacks funding. Has many political constraints and hinders ability to respond to emergencies. The global R&D system is highly fragmented, with only a few countries that can support end-to-end R&D system, from basic research all the way to procurement. And of course, every country is worried about its own citizen, and of course, first take care of its own citizen. Next slide. Nikki Leary, Gerald Kirsch, and I wrote a paper in Lancet, which we interviewed 60 more leaders and put together our assessment of R&D pre-COVID. It's fragmented, poorly coordinated, under-resourced, and there's inadequate capacity or capabilities to ensure that the R&D system could rapidly manufacture and distribute countermeasures at pandemic scale to all countries. You know, the traditional linear model of R&D, from discovery to development to application, manufacturing has to change because it's too slow. You really have to permit multiple steps to proceed in parallel, shorten the time. For example, when you have a vaccine in phase 3, you have to start doing risk manufacturing because if you wait till you get the results from phase 3 and approval and start manufacturing, it will be too late. Next slide. So the good news is in April, late April, the world leaders got together, particularly in global health, and begin to say, how can we work together so that everyone in the world everywhere can access new vaccines, tests, and treatments? Next slide. This result formation of, as Marilyn said, the access to COVID tools, ACT, accelerator, Act A we call it, and it's a global response to COVID-19. It's bringing together many players under a facilitation council co-governed by WHO, European Union, European Commission, 26 governments and others. But it's coordinated by a coordination hub housed at WHO and is overseen by a set of ACT accelerator principles, of which I'm one of them. And the idea is to create 3 pillars, one for vaccine, one for therapeutics, one for diagnostic, with a cross-cutting pillar called Health Systems Connector, overseeing, for example, the need for health system, oxygen, PPE, and others. And it's end-to-end. That is to say, not only R&D, but also manufacturing, procurement, and deployment, with the presence of WHO, UNICEF, and others in deployment, but also many other actors, as you can see here, focusing on these 3 pillars or 4 pillars. Next slide. Now, this is unprecedented because we're dealing with many different global health organizations, such as WHO, Gavi, the Alliance for Vaccine, CEPI, the Vaccine Development R&D Organization, Wellcome Trust, Unitate, the World Bank, Global Fund, and FIND, and many others. And this collection of voluntary collaboration is unprecedented and was really important in moving forward and thinking about cooperation across all these areas to prepare the world for the COVID-19. Next slide. Now, one aspect, for example, is COVAX, which is the vaccine pillar. COVAX is coordinated by Gavi, WHO, UNICEF, and CEPI. And in fact, if you look at COVAX, it has the participation of 190 economies in total. So cooperation in coming together in the 96 countries that are AMC under Gavi, poor countries. And then, as you can see in the slide, many self-financing involvement of many countries. The idea would be everybody cooperates to put their resources together, to buy vaccines together, and to share and coordinate together. As you hear later on, it didn't happen, at least not very well. Next slide. So the goal of Act A is to have by 2 billion doses by the end of 2021 to be able to distribute to all countries, especially low-income countries, so that we can vaccinate maybe 10 to 20% of the population, and then, of course, eventually all. Now, Act A has extended to have another 760 million doses by mid-2022, so that it can begin to attack more accelerated the issue of COVID-19, Delta variant, and others. Also have therapeutic targets for 245 million courses, diagnostic 500 million tests by mid-2021. Now, there are good news and bad news. The good news is that, yes, with the kind of financing, we're able to procure 2.5 billion doses. But the bad news is only 240 million vaccines have been shipped to 139 countries, and we'll talk about that. Same for diagnostic tests, which is way underperforming, but also it's able to get treatment courses, but not sufficiently. but also has oxygen and PPE supplies. Next slide. So ante financing is an important situation. Very beginning, and looking at the budget all the way to mid-2021, it needed $38 billion. And with fundraising, with many different activities, it's been able to raise $17.7 billion and still remaining a gap of $16.8 billion. And those, of course, are really important for diagnostic therapeutics and, of course, vaccine as well. Next slide. So the message about cooperation versus competition. To begin, when you don't have an organization, that's all ready to go, and it has to raise money. Now, while you're flying the plane, obviously it's very difficult. So it never had enough financing to scale up for entire impact. And the financing is dependent on the donor assistance model. That is, that you're looking for global assistance. It depends on the benevolence of rich donors. So that's resulting in a shortfall. You have to keep hand in hand, keep going back to rich countries to ask for more money. Now, even though there's cooperation, but each individual country makes its own decision of to give or not to give. And of course, the governance is one of cooperation, but light touch. Very beginning, each one of the global entities want to continue doing their own work, but they will come together under the pillars. And the pillars will itself, vaccine, diagnostic, therapeutics, look at its own budget, its own requirement, and then roll up together as a total. So there's not really major decisions of prioritization of a common fund, if you will. And of course, engaging all countries to work together to have equitable access has been a major challenge. There are technical challenges too, because the lack of success in therapeutics, and I'll come back to that about clinical trials. And then, of course, eventually the rollout of vaccines, diagnostic therapeutics, with manufacturing, supply chain, distribution challenges. Next slide. We see problems everywhere. For example, let's take vaccine. Currently, the world has actually quite a lot of vaccine. More than almost 6 billion doses have been administered globally, with 80% to high and upper middle income countries. Unfortunately, only 0.3% of doses have gone to low income countries. So at this rate, most people in poorest countries will not be vaccinated until 2023. And you can imagine the problem, because as long as you're vaccine somewhere in the world incubating and infecting, we're not going to be able to control the COVID-19 or the SARS-CoV-2. One of the problems is very early in the pandemic, even though there's COVAX, countries coming together to say they pull in resources and work together, rich countries started making its own deal because they cannot wait. So they're having a lot more money, like US and other countries. You can see that rich countries have some jurisdiction have accumulated huge amount of surplus vaccines by end of 2021. 6 jurisdictions, EU, UK, US, Japan, Brazil, Canada, in fact, will account for 90% of the surplus of vaccines. And so next slide. This slide shows you the procurement, that is what they have bought. It's not what they have right now. You can see there's almost like 11 billion doses by the end of the year. If you look at all the deals that you made, with 3.74 billion in high-income countries. As you can see, the spread in middle and low-income countries, middle-income countries, with low-income countries having only about 3-point-some billion, of which COVAX bought 2.5. So what's the problem when we do have all these deals? Next slide. The problem is, number one, is that, of course, the rich countries have tied up all the surplus. But manufacturing is a problem because there are limited number of manufacturing sites, and most of them are rich countries. And so they can only provide the vaccines, first of all, to areas where they manufacture, rich countries. And so there's not a distributed, equitable vaccine manufacturing capacity everywhere. Second is many countries use export restrictions to ensure that those meet the domestic needs. For example, a huge production manufacturing organization called Serum Institute of India was supposed to supply most of the biggest supplier of COVAX. But India imposed export control when the second wave of COVID, so that nothing gets actually to the other countries. And of course, there are problems with supplies and storage capacity and supply chain, which also requires coordination and collaboration. And then, of course, ultimately, individual countries are highly variable in the ability to distribute the vaccine. Because of that, there are countries now like Africa, together, all of Africa Union with CDC, Africa CDC has created the Vaccine Acquisition Trust, AVAT, to start buying their own vaccine away from COVAX. Now you can see what the problems are. Next slide. So R&D is not enough. We need to share data. That data sharing and infrastructure so that we can quickly conduct real-time surveillance and ensure coordination collaboration is necessary. And that's another problem. In clinical trials, you can see the second bullet, poor coordination and poor incentives for collaboration, the lack of prioritization resulted in slowness of clinical trial. And of course, we need to create, through innovation, new ways of designing clinical trials to make things faster. Same for regulation. We have WHO, we have FDA, EMA, and the harmonization is not quite as good, so that each vaccine has to go through different regulation, different regions. I already talked about manufacturing, supply chain shortages, and the lack of manufacturing in poor income countries, and tremendous concern for public trust. Next slide. So I think you would agree with me, under these circumstances, there's an urgent need for cooperation. First of all, given the fact that rich countries have so much surplus, at least by the end of the year, they should start donating and immediately address the shortage of countries that do not have access to vaccines, as well as diagnostic and therapeutics. We have to find ways to expand manufacturing equitably, that is, distribute manufacturing regions in Africa and elsewhere where there's no manufacturing. This way, at least we'll have manufacturing in the regions that's needed and not dependent and controlled by a few manufacturing sites in high-income countries. We need financing, and we need to relax and waive intellectual property protection and tech transfer. Now, as you know, there is in fact a proposal to do an IP waiver only for COVID vaccine during this time. But I think things are going to move very slowly. But of course, allowing IP waiver will allow countries worldwide to make generic versions so they can go much faster. But my feeling is IP is absolutely important, but during this time of crisis, we can relax it for a short period of time and then go back only under these circumstances and go back to before. But waiver is necessary but not sufficient. We need raw material, facilities, manufacturing. We need tech transfer, know-how, operationalize these manufacturing sites, different places, training. For example, mRNA vaccine requires skill expertise. So there's lots of cooperation needed. And one word to put COVID-19 out of our life altogether. Next slide. So I think we've learned a lot of lessons from COVID-19. First, we do need strategy and coordination, public health intervention, and of course, data innovations at both national and global levels. We need a coordinated end-to-end from R&D all the way to deployment for preparedness response for vaccine therapeutic diagnostics. We need multilateralism. All countries have worked together and to get coordination, equitable access, because there's no equity without solidarity. We need a governance structure so that everybody can function coherently and effectively at all levels. And we need sustainable financing. The donor assistance model is not sufficient. we need a multilateral level mechanism, such as sharing of burdens, assigning, like in WHO with its member state, specific, according to GDP, the amount of dollars needed in order to put together an amount needed to be able to do all the work it's supposed to do during preparedness and response. Next slide. So I'm going to end by telling you about two major reports that actually recommend this. First is the WHO Independent Panel for Preparedness Response, chaired by Prime Minister Sirleaf and Helen Clark. And they said immediately we need to commit to provide the poor countries through COVAX at least 1 billion doses by September 2021. Well, guess what? The date has passed, hasn't happened. And more than 2 billion doses by mid-2022. And that G7 countries must come together, provide 60% of the gap for Act A. That still hasn't happened as yet. We have to create a Global Threats Council so that the heads of state and government are involved with the health response. Invest in preparedness, invest in surveillance, and establish a cooperation, a pre-negotiated platform for tools and supplies, taking Act A and making it a truly global, sustainable end-to-end platform to secure technology transfer and commitment to voluntary sharing and sensing, and of course, enable strong regional capacity for manufacturing, regulation, procurement. Sorry, the word is licensing, voluntary licensing, and of course, a new international financing for pandemic. Next slide. And of course, in the G20, next slide, there was a commission of high-level independent panel co-chaired by Senior Minister Tarman from Singapore, Professor Larry Summers from Harvard, previous Treasury First Secretary of the United States, and Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's the Director General of the World Trade Organization. The secretariat is by the U.S. Academy of Medicine and Wellcome Trust, and the finding is the global health security is severely underfunded. And we can agree in this report with others that development assistance is not sustainable. Instead, we need reliable multilateral funding to enable the World Bank and IMF to support global commons and to strong incentive for low-income countries to invest in global public goods. Next slide. Importantly, the report suggests that all governments must come together collectively to commit to an increasing amount of international funding by at least $75 billion over the next few years. By the way, that's only 1/1000th of the economic impact of COVID to date, which is, as you know, in the tens of trillions of dollars. But here we're talking about $15 billion each year, of which 2/3 of this, $10 billion per year, would be into a fund called Global Health Threats Fund, which will be shared commonly across all entities to make prioritization decisions. The remainder of the $5 billion a year will go towards existing institutions like WHO and others. Two very important recommendations. One is you need this fund to be applied for global public goods, for surveillance, to look at research, supply chain, manufacturing, and of course, to have in-country investments. And to oversee this, we need a global health threats board, which is made of G20 plus to oversee, made of health minister and finance minister, cooperation between the two, instead of moving in parallel streams to look at effective use of the funds. Next slide. My last slide. Oh, one more. G7, with the leadership of UK, had came up with this mandate of a 100-day mission to respond to future global threats. The first 100 days within an epidemic outbreak or pandemic threat are crucial to get everybody ready to and prevent it from pandemic. So the idea would be within the first 100 days, working with a target of Cepiva vaccine, but with also all the others, that they propose a Apollo mission of the modern age to bring together cooperation international community. Within the first 100 days, they will aim to get an accurate, approved, rapid point of care diagnostic, initial regimen therapeutics, and vaccines ready. And of course, US has joined this, as is other countries, to do this 100-day mission. My final slide. So in summary, last slide. The new norm. I do think global competition is good when it spurs innovation and is shared by everyone and it helps economy and benefits society. However, during the times of crisis, competition and self-interest have very negative consequences. Global public good necessities working together for common purpose, shared benefits, and for global pandemic response coordination, cooperation must be the norm. Cooperation and good competition are important for preparedness. Thank you very much.
Victor, thank you very much for this, well, somehow shocking presentation. I mean, if I quote you, the global R&D system is fragmented, poorly coordinated, and under-resourced. And another highlight I've heard is that somehow countries and regions around the world have to come up with their own solutions that are sometimes more or less efficient. We are running out of time, but there is just one question I need to ask you. I can't let you go without asking you. I mean, you've taken your international hat here, but you're also at the head of the US Academy of Medicine. So the one question I have is actually, the White House has been extremely clear about its willingness to come back to the international table on the road to Glasgow and COP26. What is it going to be with health? What can we expect from the US? Is it international cooperation, cooperating with the others, or is the country going to protect its own market first?
Well, I can tell you for sure that US is all back in the game. From the days when it says it will not support WHO, there's a lot of work done along with the WHO. US has joined Act A, which it did not at the beginning. And of course, US is donating 500 million doses and possibly even more of vaccines. But importantly, US has been discussing about leading a set of countries, working with Norway and others, to discuss about the creation of this global health fund. And leading up to the United Nations General Assembly and also the G20, US, in fact, is leading a lot of conversation about the contribution to this fund, as we said, that's needed for cooperation, etc. Finally, in the 100 days, US is actively working with UK to look at 100 days. So we are back. And we're back 100% and more, just like the climate change. There's tremendous interest in working together. I can assure you that there will be good cooperation going forward.
Thank you, Victor. Well, this is excellent news. With this, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again very soon. You've raised a number of points that are going to lead us very neatly, very naturally to our next session that is going to look at technology development and ownership and the lessons learned from the COVID pandemic. So, Mr. Dzau, Dr. Dzau, thank you very much again, and I will now hand over to my colleague Simon Pickard. He is the director of the Science Business Network. Simon will introduce the next panel.